In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where the streets were lined with neatly trimmed hedges and colorful flower beds, lived a man named Arthur. To his neighbors, he was just another friendly face in the community, a retired engineer who kept to himself, but always waved hello. What no one knew, however, was that beneath his unassuming demeanor lay a secret decades in the making. Beneath the surface of his modest property, hidden from prying eyes, was an underground marvel, a state-of-the-art shelter built with precision and care. Arthur's fascination with survival began when he was a child. Growing up during the Cold War, he often heard stories about nuclear threats and natural disasters on the news. These tales left a lasting impression on him, sparking a lifelong passion for preparedness. As an adult, Arthur channeled this interest into engineering, using his skills to design innovative solutions for complex problems. But it wasn't until he purchased his first home in the suburbs that his dream truly took shape. Over the years, he poured countless hours, and much of his savings, into constructing a hidden refuge under his house. The shelter was nothing short of extraordinary. It had reinforced steel walls, advanced air filtration systems, and solar panels cleverly disguised as part of his backyard landscaping. There were shelves stocked with canned goods, medical supplies, and tools, all meticulously organized. A small library of books provided comfort and knowledge, while a generator ensured power even if the grid went down. It wasn't just a bunker, it was a sanctuary designed to protect not only Arthur, but also anyone else who might need refuge during a crisis. For years, Arthur kept his project completely secret. Even close friends and family didn't know about it. He told himself it was better this way. It wasn't something people would understand. Besides, privacy gave him peace of mind. But life has a way of throwing unexpected challenges at us, and Arthur's peaceful existence wouldn't last forever. As time went on, Arthur faced some tough personal setbacks. Health issues forced him to retire earlier than planned, leaving him financially strained. Bills piled up faster than he could manage, and reluctantly, he made the difficult decision to sell his beloved home. Selling the house meant letting go of many memories, but there was one thing Arthur refused to part with: the land beneath it. Thanks to a little-known clause in his original deed, he retained ownership of the subsurface rights. At the time, it seemed like a smart move, a safeguard against future uncertainty, but he never imagined how important that choice would become. Years passed, and Arthur moved into a small apartment nearby. Though he missed his old home, he found solace knowing his shelter remained untouched. Occasionally, he'd visit the neighborhood, walking past his former property and checking for signs of disturbance around the hidden entrance. Everything appeared normal, and Arthur allowed himself to relax. Little did he know, trouble was brewing right above his prized creation. The neighborhood's homeowners association, HOA, had big plans for the area, and those plans would soon bring Arthur's world crashing down. This simple yet intriguing setup sets the stage for the story, drawing readers in with curiosity about Arthur's mysterious past and the secrets buried beneath his old home. By focusing on relatable themes like resilience, ingenuity, and the desire for security, the narrative becomes engaging without overwhelming the audience. The neighborhood where Arthur once lived was changing. The quiet, tree-lined streets that had always felt so serene were now buzzing with activity. Families came and went. Children played in the cul-de-sacs, and the homeowners association, HOA, grew more ambitious by the year. This group of residents, tasked with maintaining the community's charm and functionality, had grand visions for making their suburb stand out. They wanted a space where neighbors could gather, not just for casual chats, but for celebrations, meetings, and events. And so, they decided to build a meeting hall. At first, the idea seemed harmless enough. A central hub for the community sounded nice, and many residents eagerly supported the plan. Fundraising efforts began, and soon the HOA secured enough money through membership fees and bank loans to get the project off the ground. The location they chose, a large, open lot near the heart of the neighborhood. Arthur's old property. It was spacious, accessible, and already cleared of trees, making it the perfect spot for their dream building. What the HOA didn't know, and what no one bothered to check, was that this land held secrets buried deep beneath its surface. Plans for the meeting hall quickly took shape. Architectural drawings showcased a sleek, modern structure with tall windows, polished floors, and a cozy fireplace. There would be a kitchen for potluck dinners, a stage for performances, and even a small library corner. The HOA envisioned it as the beating heart of the neighborhood, a place where friendships would flourish and memories would be made. Construction crews arrived within weeks, ready to turn these blueprints into reality. Bulldozers rumbled across the site, digging trenches for foundations and hauling away dirt by the truckload. But not everyone watched these developments with excitement. From his modest apartment nearby, Arthur observed the chaos unfolding on his former property with growing unease. He noticed how close the excavation work was getting to the edge of his underground shelter. Vibrations from heavy machinery rattled the ground, causing cracks to form in the shelter's ventilation system. For Arthur, this wasn't just some inconvenience. It was a direct threat to something he'd spent decades building. Every shovelful of earth removed brought him closer to panic. How could they not know what lay below? Or worse, did they know and simply not care? Arthur wrestled with whether to speak up. On one hand, stepping forward meant revealing his long-hidden secret, the shelter he'd poured his soul into creating. Would people understand? Or would they see him as eccentric or paranoid? On the other hand, staying silent risked losing everything he'd worked so hard to protect. As days turned into weeks, the construction crew dug deeper, oblivious to the treasure trove beneath their feet. Arthur knew he couldn't wait much longer. Something had to be done. But what? This part of the story introduces tension while keeping readers hooked. By focusing on the HOA's seemingly innocent plans and contrasting them with Arthur's mounting anxiety, the narrative builds intrigue. Readers are drawn into the conflict, wondering how Arthur will respond and what consequences might arise from the HOA's actions. The stakes feel real, yet relatable, ensuring engagement without resorting to overly dramatic or inappropriate content. Arthur couldn't ignore the situation any longer. The cracks forming in his shelter's ventilation system were a clear warning sign. His hidden sanctuary was in danger. If the damage worsened, it wouldn't just compromise the shelter's functionality. It could render it completely useless. After weeks of watching from the sidelines, he decided it was time to act. Gathering all the documents that proved his ownership of the subsurface land beneath his old property, Arthur approached the HOA board during one of their monthly meetings. The room was filled with familiar faces, neighbors he'd once lived alongside, people who had smiled at him on morning walks or waved hello over backyard fences. But as Arthur stood there, clutching his papers and explaining his claim, those same neighbors stared back at him with confusion and disbelief. He showed them copies of his deed, highlighting the clause that explicitly stated his retention of mineral and subsurface rights. He explained how the construction was encroaching on his property, damaging something he'd spent years building underground. To Arthur, it seemed straightforward, a matter of law and fairness. But the HOA members weren't convinced. Some exchanged skeptical glances, while others openly scoffed. An underground shelter. One member asked, raising an eyebrow, "You expect us to believe you built some kind of bunker under there?" Another chimed in, accusing him of fabricating the story to sabotage their project. "Why didn't you say anything when you sold the house?" Another demanded. Their tone shifted from disbelief to defensiveness, as if Arthur's claims were not only unbelievable, but also personally offensive. Despite their skepticism, Arthur remained calm. He offered to show them proof, suggesting they inspect the site themselves. But instead of agreeing, the board dismissed him outright. They insisted the plans for the meeting hall were final and non-negotiable. "We've already invested too much money into this," the HOA president declared firmly. "There's no going back now." Others nodded in agreement, brushing off Arthur's concerns as irrelevant. It was clear they viewed him as an obstacle standing in the way of progress, a stubborn man clinging to outdated paperwork. As Arthur left the meeting, frustration bubbling inside him, he realized the HOA wasn't going to budge without a fight. They had made up their minds, dismissing his claims without even considering the truth. For the first time in years, Arthur felt truly alone. His neighbors, once friendly and welcoming, now saw him as an adversary. The sense of betrayal stung deeply. He'd lived among them for years, shared holidays and casual conversations, yet here they were, refusing to listen to reason. Determined not to give up, Arthur began researching legal options. He scoured online forums, consulted friends with experience in real estate, and even reached out to local authorities to see if there was any way to halt construction temporarily. Each step felt like wading through quicksand, frustrating and exhausting, but Arthur refused to let go. His shelter wasn't just a personal project. It represented years of hard work, sacrifice, and vision. More than anything, it symbolized his belief in preparedness, in being ready for whatever life might throw his way. And now it was under attack, not by nature or disaster, but by the very people he'd once called neighbors. This part of the story deepens the conflict, showing Arthur's growing desperation and the widening gap between him and the HOA. By emphasizing the emotional weight of the situation, his feelings of isolation and betrayal, the narrative keeps readers engaged. At the same time, the tension builds naturally, setting the stage for the legal battle ahead while avoiding overly dramatic or inappropriate content. Frustrated but undeterred, Arthur knew he couldn't take on the HOA alone. He needed someone who understood the intricacies of property law, someone sharp enough to navigate the tangled web of deeds, clauses, and legal precedents. After days of searching, he found exactly what he was looking for: a seasoned real estate attorney named Margaret Hayes. Known for her expertise in obscure property disputes, Margaret had a reputation for tackling cases others deemed too complicated or unwinnable. When Arthur explained his situation during their initial consultation, she listened intently, her eyes narrowing as she flipped through his documents. "This is fascinating," Margaret said finally, leaning back in her chair. "The subsurface rights clause in your deed is solid. If you retained ownership of the land beneath the property, then technically they're infringing on your rights." She paused, tapping a pen against her desk. "But this isn't going to be easy. The HOA has deep pockets, and they'll fight tooth and nail to protect their investment." Arthur nodded grimly. He'd already seen how dismissive the HOA could be, but hearing it from a professional made the challenge feel even more daunting. Still, he wasn't about to back down. With Margaret's guidance, they filed a lawsuit against the HOA, citing violations of his mineral and subsurface ownership rights. The case quickly gained traction when federal authorities stepped in, intrigued by potential breaches of environmental regulations during construction. News of the dispute spread like wildfire, drawing media attention and turning the once peaceful neighborhood into a battleground of opinions. The HOA fought back fiercely. They hired their own team of lawyers, arguing that Arthur's claims were baseless and exaggerated. Public statements from the association painted him as a troublemaker trying to derail their project out of spite. Some neighbors rallied behind the HOA, convinced that Arthur was holding the community hostage over an old grudge. Others, however, began questioning the fairness of the situation. Why hadn't the HOA checked the property records before starting construction? Wasn't it reckless to proceed without verifying ownership of the land below? As the legal battle unfolded, tensions in the neighborhood reached a boiling point. Yard signs popped up overnight, some supporting the meeting hall, others demanding justice for Arthur. Social media exploded with heated debates, hashtags trending locally as residents took sides. Even local news outlets covered the story, framing it as a clash between individual rights and communal progress. For Arthur, the spotlight was uncomfortable but necessary. Every interview, every article, brought more attention to his cause and more pressure on the HOA to address his concerns. Behind the scenes, Arthur worked tirelessly with Margaret to strengthen their case. They gathered evidence, including geological surveys that confirmed the extent of the damage to his shelter, and expert testimonies highlighting its value as a disaster relief resource. Margaret also uncovered a critical detail. The HOA had failed to conduct proper due diligence before purchasing the lot. This oversight not only undermined their credibility, but also strengthened Arthur's argument that they had acted negligently. Despite the mounting challenges, Arthur remained resolute. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew he was fighting for something bigger than himself. His shelter wasn't just a personal achievement. It represented resilience, foresight, and the importance of being prepared for life's uncertainties. And as the legal proceedings dragged on, one thing became clear. Arthur wasn't just standing up for his rights. He was standing up for the principle that no one should lose what's rightfully theirs without a fair fight. This part of the story keeps readers engaged by diving deeper into the legal drama while exploring the emotional toll on Arthur. By balancing courtroom strategies with the growing divide in the community, the narrative builds suspense and highlights the broader themes of fairness and perseverance. The stakes continue to rise, ensuring the audience stays invested in the outcome. As the legal battle raged on, the neighborhood became a powder keg of emotions. The once quiet streets were now filled with tension, whispers, and heated arguments at every turn. Arthur's lawsuit against the HOA had drawn a clear line in the sand, dividing residents into two camps. On one side stood those who supported the meeting hall, a project they believed would bring the community together and enhance their quality of life. On the other side were those who sympathized with Arthur, seeing him as a man fighting to protect what was rightfully his. Caught in the middle were the undecided neighbors, unsure whom to trust or which side represented justice. The HOA refused to budge, doubling down on their stance that halting construction would bankrupt them. They argued that dismantling the partially built structure or altering its foundation to accommodate Arthur's claims would cost far more than completing it. Their lawyers presented this argument passionately in court, painting Arthur as an obstacle standing in the way of progress. But Arthur wasn't backing down either. With Margaret by his side, he introduced a bold new angle to the case: federal backing based on national security concerns. Arthur's shelter, he argued, wasn't just a personal bunker. It was a resource that could serve the greater good during emergencies. Recent natural disasters in neighboring regions had highlighted how vulnerable communities could be without proper infrastructure. His shelter, equipped with advanced systems for air filtration, power generation, and water purification, could house dozens of people safely for extended periods. Margaret emphasized this point in court, suggesting that destroying or compromising such a facility would be reckless and irresponsible. To everyone's surprise, federal authorities agreed. One crisp morning, federal agents arrived at the construction site, placing it under temporary protection while the courts deliberated further. Yellow tape surrounded the area, and workers were ordered to halt all activity immediately. The sight sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. For the HOA, it felt like a nightmare come true. Their dream project frozen indefinitely, their finances stretched thin, and public opinion turning increasingly volatile. For Arthur, it was both a victory and a burden. He'd managed to protect his shelter, but the fallout from this move only deepened the rift between him and his former neighbors. Tensions escalated further when the HOA called an emergency meeting, inviting residents to voice their frustrations. Emotions ran high as accusations flew back and forth. Some accused Arthur of manipulating the system to sabotage the meeting hall, while others criticized the HOA for ignoring property rights and rushing into construction without proper checks. Tempers flared, voices rose, and at one point, the meeting nearly dissolved into chaos. It was a stark reminder of how deeply divided the community had become. Through it all, Arthur kept a low profile, avoiding confrontations and focusing on the legal proceedings. Yet even he couldn't escape the weight of what was happening around him. Friends he thought he had stopped speaking to him, and strangers glared at him whenever he ventured out. At times, he questioned whether the fight was worth it. But then he'd think about his shelter, the years of effort, the sacrifices, the purpose it served, and his resolve hardened again. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about setting a precedent, ensuring that individual rights weren't trampled in the name of collective ambition. The standoff reached its peak when the judge overseeing the case announced a temporary injunction, prohibiting any further work on the meeting hall until the dispute was resolved. Both sides braced themselves for what lay ahead. For the HOA, it meant scrambling to find alternative funding sources and preparing for the possibility of losing everything they'd worked so hard to build. For Arthur, it meant continuing to fight not only for his shelter, but also for the respect and understanding he deserved from the very people he once called neighbors. This part of the story heightens the drama, focusing on the emotional and communal impact of the conflict. By exploring the division within the neighborhood and the growing stakes for both Arthur and the HOA, the narrative maintains engagement while staying grounded in relatable human experiences. The tension builds naturally, keeping readers invested in the outcome. The courtroom was tense on the day of the final verdict. Months of legal battles, heated arguments, and sleepless nights had led to this moment. Arthur sat quietly beside Margaret, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Across the aisle, the HOA board members exchanged nervous glances, their faces pale with apprehension. The judge entered the room, and a hush fell over everyone as he began reading his decision. After carefully reviewing all evidence, Arthur's original deed, geological reports, expert testimonies, and federal input, the judge ruled in Arthur's favor. The ruling acknowledged that Arthur legally owned the subsurface land beneath his former property and condemned the HOA for failing to verify ownership before beginning construction. Furthermore, the court recognized the shelter's potential value as an emergency resource, reinforcing the importance of preserving it. The HOA was ordered to halt further work on the meeting hall and dismantle parts of the structure that encroached upon Arthur's shelter. For the HOA, the ruling was devastating. Not only did they lose the case, but the financial implications were catastrophic. The cost of dismantling portions of the building, combined with mounting legal fees, left them teetering on the brink of collapse. Desperate attempts to appeal the decision failed, as higher courts upheld the original judgment. Within months, the association dissolved entirely, leaving behind unpaid debts and unfinished projects. The neighborhood, once united by shared goals and aspirations, now felt fractured and uncertain about its future. As for Arthur, the victory came at a price. While he had successfully reclaimed his shelter, the battle had taken its toll. He no longer felt welcome in the community where he'd spent so many years of his life. Neighbors who once greeted him warmly now avoided eye contact or muttered under their breath when he passed by. Some even accused him of ruining their dream of a better neighborhood, ignoring the fact that the HOA's negligence had sparked the conflict in the first place. For Arthur, it was a bitter reminder that winning doesn't always mean healing. Still, there were small moments of vindication. Federal authorities praised Arthur's foresight in creating such a valuable disaster relief resource. Local news outlets revisited the story, highlighting how his shelter could serve as a model for communities preparing for emergencies. Though these acknowledgments didn't erase the pain of the past months, they gave Arthur some measure of peace. Knowing that his efforts had broader significance helped soften the sting of isolation. But perhaps the hardest part was letting go of the sense of belonging he'd once cherished. Arthur missed the camaraderie of neighborhood barbecues, holiday parties, and casual chats over garden fences. Those simple joys seemed distant now, replaced by a lingering awkwardness whenever he crossed paths with former neighbors. Even so, he refused to dwell on resentment. Instead, he focused on what mattered most: protecting his shelter and ensuring it remained intact for whatever challenges the future might hold. In the end, the standoff taught Arthur an important lesson about human nature. People often prioritize convenience over fairness, progress over principle. But standing up for what is right, even when it means standing alone, isn't just about personal gain. It's about setting boundaries and demanding accountability. As he walked away from the courthouse that day, Arthur knew he'd done everything he could to protect not only his legacy, but also the values he believed in. The scars would remain, but so would the knowledge that sometimes fighting for justice is worth every ounce of sacrifice. This part of the story captures the emotional complexity of Arthur's victory, while emphasizing the fallout from the prolonged conflict. By balancing the triumph of reclaiming his shelter with the personal and communal costs, the narrative remains engaging without resorting to overly dramatic or inappropriate content. Readers are left reflecting on the themes of perseverance, fairness, and the bittersweet nature of hard-won victories. In the months following the court's decision, Arthur found himself at a crossroads. The shelter was safe, legally recognized, and protected, but his relationship with the neighborhood remained strained. The bitterness left in the wake of the legal battle weighed heavily on him. He missed the sense of community he'd once known, but rebuilding trust seemed impossible. Determined to find a way forward, Arthur made a bold decision. Instead of keeping the shelter hidden, he would open it up to carefully selected neighbors. The idea came to him one evening as he sat inside the bunker, surrounded by its walls that had withstood so much turmoil. What good was a sanctuary if it only served one person? The shelter wasn't just his life's work. It could be a lifeline for others in times of need. With this realization, Arthur began reaching out to former neighbors who had shown even a hint of neutrality or understanding during the conflict. He invited them to tour the shelter, explaining its purpose and sharing stories of how it had been built with care and dedication over decades. At first, responses were mixed. Some declined outright, still harboring resentment toward Arthur for what they saw as selfishness. Others, however, accepted out of curiosity, or perhaps because they sensed an opportunity to mend fences. Those who visited were astonished by what they saw. The shelter was far more than they'd imagined. A meticulously designed space, filled with supplies, advanced systems, and thoughtful touches like books, board games, and comfortable seating. It wasn't just functional, it felt almost welcoming. Arthur used these tours as a chance to explain his perspective. He spoke candidly about why he built the shelter, how it represented years of hard work and sacrifice, and why protecting it had meant so much to him. Slowly but surely, attitudes began to shift. Neighbors who had dismissed him as paranoid or unreasonable started seeing him in a new light. They realized that Arthur wasn't trying to sabotage their dreams. He was simply defending something deeply personal and meaningful. Word spread quietly among residents. More people requested tours, eager to see the shelter for themselves. Some brought their families, showing children how ingenuity and preparation could make a difference in emergencies. A few even offered to help maintain the facility, volunteering time or resources to ensure it stayed operational. For Arthur, these gestures meant more than words. They signaled a tentative step toward healing. Over time, the shelter transformed from a point of contention into a symbol of unity. When natural disasters struck nearby areas, several neighbors suggested using the bunker as a temporary evacuation site for displaced families. Arthur agreed, feeling proud that his creation could serve a greater purpose. The experience brought the community closer together, fostering cooperation and mutual respect where there had once been division. Though scars remained, the neighborhood slowly began to heal. The abandoned meeting hall site became a quiet park, funded by donations from both sides of the dispute. It featured benches, walking paths, and a small plaque commemorating resilience, a nod to the lessons learned from the conflict. Arthur often visited the park, watching children play and neighbors chat. It reminded him that progress isn't always perfect, but it's worth striving for. Looking back, Arthur knew the journey had changed him. He'd fought fiercely for what was right, endured isolation, and emerged stronger, not just in spirit, but in connection to those around him. His shelter stood not only as a testament to preparedness, but also as proof that redemption is possible, even after the hardest battles. And while the road ahead might still hold challenges, Arthur faced it with hope, knowing he'd helped turn adversity into something extraordinary.